What's going on, everybody? It's Frito here for Your Overwatch. We're finally going to get a chance to talk more in depth about 5v5. Been wanting to do this, but the experimental card just went into the live game with a few changes, so I wanted to cover them quickly to emphasize what is different than expected. So Exo Boots gets a revert nerf, so it's going to take you longer to charge up. That's going to be important, but especially after I think the recent Overwatch League matches and Super being quite upset at the state of the high-level competitive game, Echo's getting a surprise nerf to Duplicate, which wasn't on the experimental card originally, where now Duplicate's ultimate cost is going to be increased by 15%, which is significant. Going to slow down the pacing of all of this, but I think what's important is, especially when you have multiple characters that have extra lives stacked together in the same team, especially in the Overwatch League format where there's hero pools, it starts to get a little tricky. And this is perhaps a side conversation about why it's a mistake for the devs to balance for the pros at all when they're playing a literally different format to us, but that would be a conversation for another day. Echo is a character that you might anticipate to increase in power as a character like McCree goes down anyway, so this seems like a justified nerf, but perhaps not enough. McCree's nerfs went through as is. The biggest difference you'll see here is with the reload time nerf, continuously spamming Fan the Hammer won't be as advantageous as it used to be, meaning McCree's matchup, especially against tanks, is going to be quite a lot different. He's not going to be able to burn down their shields and health pools as easily, at least not without gaining a significant period of downtime, which will be enhanced by the fact that his combat role doesn't go as far, meaning hitting him or isolating him with positioning is going to be easier. But there's still a lot of things going for McCree with his playstyle being very complete, especially with his 225 health points and stun, hit scan damage, meaning that if you master him, he really can interact with most relevant things in the game. But at the very least, I think you'll find countering McCree easier now. Change up here, Moira's buff does go through where the resource regens much faster while in coalescence. They say in the patch notes that you'll get about half of your healing resources back through a full channel of coalescence. When I tested it in the video prior, it seems like you got even more than that, but either way, an important problem with this is that with all of the cooldown and ultimate cycling Moira can do, that would mean that she would simply just have more coalescences than she did before as well, and more easily channel them back to back. So in order to compensate, Coalescence's ultimate cooldown has been increased by 17%, which feels like kind of an oddly specific number. This last change wasn't included in the experimental card, and actually has some pretty interesting implications. Although this means the rotation of time between Moira using coal into her next coal is now improved due to the resources coming back. One of Moira's biggest strengths, which is the early fight farming of coalescence, is now nerfed, right? Because this whole biotic grass buff doesn't come into effect until she uses that first ult. So that means the coalescence ultimate cost increase is a specific nerf to that first start of an engagement. Particularly opening fights on control maps, you're going to notice this a lot. Those really brawly fights, you used to always get the first ultimate. I'm curious to see if, for example, maybe Nano Boost charges as fast or faster, or Batiste Window. That might have a much bigger implication on this playstyle than you think. Next buff to Reaper will let him hold his ground up against tanky heroes much more than before, and a nerf to Zarya that, having talked to you guys a little bit from the previous video, it's important to note what this does and doesn't change. So the scaling of her damage, as we know, goes up through every single point of charge she gains by absorbing damage with her bubbles. Well, now that scaling point begins at a lower value, but it's going to ramp up to end in the same place, which means lower amounts of charge will net less damage than the previous version, but as you gain more and more charge, you're barely going to notice a difference, all the way to the point of, and I think I saw this on Reddit somewhere, those top charge values are like just a couple damage less than before. So keep that in mind. Your damage is less threatening now with low charge. Now, with all that said, let's get on to the rest of the video. Let me know your thoughts on the new Overwatch patch in the comment section down below. All right, guys, now let's move on to our regular scheduled programming. I've been meaning to bring up some of the hidden downsides to 5v5 that I feel I haven't heard a single person mention what I think is the biggest problem with it. But in truth, I think it's an amazing move for the game on so many levels, and that'll still be my conclusion, but I think we need to accurately understand what we're losing in transition to the new Overwatch 2 philosophy. So first, to build up to that, let's talk about the mainstream ideas that I've seen floated around on the downsides of 5v5. The first thing I see brought up is tank synergy. So say if you, as a tank player, enjoyed playing with a friend, there's all sorts of cool Overwatch things you could do playing with them. The highlight of this, of course, is Rein Zarya. Getting Bubble to go in and swing, making space, working the front line, this can be very enjoyable. And to stack on top of this, most of the chatter has been surrounding the Overwatch League and the amount of depth that can be achieved with tank synergy, the multiple different tank comps and what can be accomplished with Winston Diva or Winston Zarya, Hog Sigma, Wrecking Ball in different variations, Pulled Pork with Orisa, Roadhog, Full Poke with Sigma Hog. There's all sorts of cool comps that exist, which I admit I find incredibly interesting as a heavily dedicated player, but the very easy shortcut answer to why this isn't really an argument is that you need to look at the mainstream player base's experience in the game. I think really all you have to do is spend significant time in the average player's MMR around gold or platinum to understand why aspiring to build the game around tank synergy is a bit of a nonsense statement. And no offense, I mean, it is great when it works. I love it. I love the MOBA aspects of the game, but far too many players' experience with Overwatch is with their tank players playing DPS tanks badly, right? It's one thing to say characters like Wrecking Ball and Roadhog are strong or workable or can do a lot of cool things, but it's a whole nother thing when you feel trapped playing around a bad one of them. That is terrible and is just a DPS player playing the thick DPS and would be getting a lot more value, making everyone's life much easier if they played a real tank, at especially like gold is particularly bad for this. Now, this isn't to say that you can't carry that player or get out of gold. There's a whole separate argument. But the point is the experience of playing with that mentality is horrible. So much so that the turn to 5v5, where you get automatic tanking value and a huge team comp gap just based on the tanks you pick, the enemy goes Rein Zarya, your Ball Hog don't know how to play those characters, feed relentlessly, and the enemy Rein gets very easy value on your whole team. That dynamic is going away with Overwatch 2, and I think that's just a good thing. 5v5 will make the game much more playable for the average player, but I said that there's a huge problem with 5v5 that no one said yet. We're going to pivot the conversation now to a very serious problem that is going to be facing the hardcore Overwatch player base, or at least the dedicated one. Hardcore is a bit of a tricky word, but if you think back to the way that Blizzard has balanced the game in the past compared to the new way they're balancing the game in recent memory from like the past year, it is a stark contrast difference. The general themes of the game to be an explosive hero shooter have finally come through. So much so that I'm trying to set a new precedent of understanding of Overwatch that it isn't what it used to be. And I'll complete this argument by the end of it, but Overwatch now, and going into Overwatch 2, is a seriously difficult competitive game, similar to DOTA, with how brutal it is on both the learning and skill curve. I think you can very easily tell the MMORPG roots of the Blizzard dev team 4, who built World of Warcraft and then went on to make Overwatch. And the problem is, if you have RPG style balancing and aspirations for your competitive game, you're going to get things like the Moth 1.0 rework, or Brigitte being an unbalanceable nightmare for years, or just stumble into the problem of double shield when you institute 222. It was constantly the case for years that the dev team had a problem balancing Overwatch because there wasn't a core competitive rule set it was operating by, and it's no offense to them. I want to point out, these guys are geniuses. They made one of the most epic, outstanding, game industry defining games ever. 60 million copies sold. Who am I to tell them that they have to play like an esport? My point is, the structure of how they design is based on the immersion of the characters, and with an attitude that they'll balance it eventually. Nothing is more clear about that than the Moth 1.0 rework. But here's where I bring to a crucial point. What are the type of players that enjoy the current style of balancing versus the RPG fantasy style of design and balancing? They expected those types of players to play their game for a long period of time. But I think this was a mistake on their part. Because although I will say, and eventually go to argue, that a huge percentage of our player base does fit into that category, I think the evidence shows of the rapid player decay from that 60 million sales point to whatever monthly active users or active players we actually have, that isn't actually the main reason so many players were enamored with Overwatch at launch. In fact, I'd go to say that this new Overwatch 2 model feels like a balanced version of the Overwatch 1 launch. I feel like with the player churn and how time has evolved, a lot of community members and perhaps even players have very short-term memory on what Overwatch is. At launch, Overwatch was a shooter game that had tank and healer characters in it. The most popular ones being Tracer, Hanzo, Genji, a lot of the DPS, of course, but with sort of a centralizing promise that you could be a great teammate playing Mercy, or focus more on positioning and physical mechanics like Reinhardt. That's the base point of the game. That's what made me fall in love with it originally, that all these different things could be balanced out in some way. And this is a game state where we had Rein 1.0, who was more shield than aggression, and the most healing you would have was Mercy. No BAP, no Moira, no Ana, no Brig, just Mercy, Lucio, and Zen. So many of the super strong MOBA elements that complicated the game in so many different ways were introduced post-launch. They took multiple steps to make the game significantly more MOBA in that timeline. But that wasn't what it was at the start. We grew to maybe understand it like that and grew to like appreciate two tanks, appreciate role queue, but that wasn't what it was at the start. Far from it. In fact, in the open queue format, it was sort of like, tanks optional. And maybe even one step further, the devs' attitude to the rule set of the game was just fairly open in general. There's a lot of good things that can come from that, but the downside is without a distinct aiming point, well, then you get all the wacky meta states that we got because they weren't trying to enforce a playstyle. They sort of just let their creations run wild, which amplifies creativity and uniqueness of characters and the immersion of them, which is great like if you're playing a PvE game like we will be in Overwatch 2, but it is like the bane of competitive balancing. Wacky nonsense causing problems. These are at odds. And the best thing for the game ever, in my opinion, is that now those wacky ideas, they don't even come to life anymore. I'm willing to bet in an alternate timeline, that really powerful Moira rework they were trying where she fades out and fades her whole team out, which could be like an ultimate level of power, that never went to live, but that could have been similar to the Moth 1.0 rework, right? Where they're just like, let's give this character a super awesome ability. Who knows if we can balance it? Shoot first, ask questions later. That's the way that was designed. Instead, I think they just get wacky and crazy and expressive with PvE, and that feels like home to them. Great. And that's where we come to Aaron Keller, as he said multiple times, that they want Overwatch 2 PvP to be more competitive. So that fundamental dichotomy will be more severe on purpose. And I think that's a great thing. But there's a certain type of player it's not great for. Now, let's get into the secret issue I have with 5v5 and where I think it's going to hurt the player base the most. It's very typical for me when I look at the average level of play that supports especially have a different mentality to how they approach Overwatch, where so many of them play every single support character as if they're Mercy, more or less hiding from first-person shooter conflict, despite the fact that they have some of the most powerful tools in the whole game while also being able to heal. They've got the disables, the game-changing ultimates, the utility that no other class has, like speed boost. These have now and forever been in the whole game some of the most powerful stuff in Overwatch. But I think the community of players that approach the support role doesn't have that flamboyant overconfidence that DPS players typically have, which might be annoying when your DPS picks Genji or Widowmaker and does nothing but get sent back to the respawn room. There's a whole nother issue with the support role that so many players tend to play just to hide behind their two tanks and heal them, avoiding interacting with the FPS game. Characters like Lucio or Ana, or surprisingly Brigitte, despite what Samito tells you, take a lot of mechanical skill and have hero shooter style matchups that you have to go win to carry the game for your team. At least when they're played properly. You start to see this impact at the higher tiers of play, where support players are insane. In the Overwatch League, you can almost guess how high a team can peak based on the power of their support class, because an otherwise average team might be able to go up a team just by having a elite level support player. Or among the elite teams, the ones who have the best support players typically have done very well. And this is what brings me to the problem of 5v5. When we take one tank out of the way, yes, of course, it makes it a little easier on supporting where you don't have two tanks to keep up. I think the reality is there's going to be quite a cultural shock for the typical support mentality when there's less tanks to buffer yourself from taking duels, essentially. This is a point that I think I messed up when I asked a question to the developers in a recent AMA. Probably needed to word it better, but I had asked them, 2 tanks can feel very satisfying and safe to play around. What does the change to 5v5 do to the gameplay, especially from the squishies point of view, the DPS and supports? And the answer I got answered a different question. They went on to say, well, it doesn't really work to focus down tanks anymore. Instead, you'll need to flank around them, which I think for many players is good news, is what they want to hear, is probably what the 50 million or so players, where many of them left the game after playing it, left due to whatever annoyances the game brought up to them. I think when they hear the game is more about those FPS fundamentals, they'll be ecstatic. But the mentality that you're going to have with the support position is going to completely change, and also to some degree, the DPS position. But as I said, I think DPS players know they have to apply pressure and get duels, but all of this is just getting harder. I think playing DPS and support, now the mechanical skill floor is automatically raised. Because if you're a player like me who tries their best to influence the tank battle above going for like Widowmaker duels, for example, well, we already know that a character like Widow is overpowered in 5v5 currently, and it's probably going to need a rework. My suggestion is they probably should take away her rapid fire shooting or make her take a longer to get up to a full charge. There's a lot of things they can do to slow down her playstyle to make it be more tactical rather than full out rapid fire carry that she can do in Overwatch 1. But either way, there'll be less ways to hide from the shooter mechanics of the game. So you can imagine things like Reaper or Maywall or Moira, who have really benefited in the either rushdown or death ball-y style of play, to drop in significance substantially to instead favor characters like Tracer. And not only that, they're doing things like increasing the speed of DPS. Now, yes, supports are going to get inherent self-heal all the time against chip damage, but at the moment, I think the supports are getting the short end of the stick in that regard, where unless that self-heal is significant with how bursty I'm expecting the engagements to go, and remember, I said, like, so much of their gameplay is getting up to that ultimate. Well, how do you get it if the engagements aren't long enough for you to heal your tanks? Now, it was noticed on the live stream that Ana did 110 damage with an attack shot, and maybe that's the kind of route they go with the support class, because since healing tanks is just less of a thing, and healing to gain your ultimate, unless they balance it and buff it to rapidly charge, I don't think that's going to be the same thing. I think secretly the supports might be getting a bit more offense too, so that all 3 roles are sort of playing for the same job with just a flavor of their unique role, as opposed to launch day Overwatch, where every single character was widely diverse. I mean, before Roll Q at the launch of the game, Symmetra was launched as a support. And in a recent AMA, a character like Sombra was originally developed as a support. Imagine that. But that inherently means all your interactions you're used to playing for as a support to influence the tank battle just sort of aren't there anymore. And they don't amount to nearly as much of the gameplay. So let me try to explain what I mean, right? If you play Zen in 222, you more or less can hide in the back and let your tanks take all the blame, basically. Because if nobody comes back to get you, you have a bit of an easier time if you can just play the snipe battle that you want. You likely aren't the first target, unless they're diving you, which is a whole other thing. But in many ways, those tanks block in your way, right? Now, you remove that tank battle from the equation, you're just constantly in squishy battles. That's the switch. It goes from like able to hide versus now you're just a DPS who also heals, which to some degree has always been the case. But at least with the nature of 222, players could not be forced with that playstyle in their face. Where I think at almost every level of play, there will be no hiding from it. It'll be uniform across all the ranks. This will be an interesting problem, but I think the devs can solve it. And ultimately, I come down on the fact that I just think our perception of what that role, just like the Brawler class, which is the thing that got all the attention so far, all roles will feel different in Overwatch 2. And this is where I come to the point where I think it's safe to say that the evolution towards a more Dota style game is complete. And the example I want to break down for you to explain what I mean and how to open up your imagination for what 5v5 Overwatch 2 might play like is looking at a team comp that the Seoul Dynasty tried in the Overwatch League recently. Now, they didn't have widespread success doing this, but it reminds me of how resources are used in Dota. a game that doesn't have a shield main tank to go push in front to make space. If we know that the brawler class will function more for fighting rather than protection, well then strategies like this with Reaper, where the Soul Dynasty put multiple cooldowns into that one player as their engage tactic, you can imagine to be better. That's how it works in Dota as well, where there isn't like a front line that you engage with. Instead, you engage with a thing like, I don't know, May's Ice Wall, or perhaps Reaper Teleport while casting protection on him. That's how you set up your engagements. And this mentality that so many Overwatch players have, where they can just stay in formation with their team safely behind their tank, is being removed from the game. Nope, map cover matters a lot, which is why when you watch any of the Overwatch 2 footage, it looks like a straight up shooter map, right? There's lots of cover, lots of angles, lots of flanks, lots of corners and stuff, as opposed to Overwatch 1 maps, which were designed with like a choke the size of a Reinhardt for you to follow him through as you go in together. That design, I think I'm gonna say like the Paris or Horizon Lunar Colony design, is just going away. Requiring that level of teamwork in order to just move forward, to go from A to B just to play the game, that's Assault or 2CP in a nutshell, and that's what they've taken out. What they've added with Push, I'm sort of imagining based on seeing it to be like payload that goes forward and backwards, which is probably fine, right? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. A different version of payload is definitely going to be better for the game and how easy it is to understand than Assault was, which required a whole separate subset knowledge base and pretty much an encyclopedia worth of knowledge of just how the game mode works just to function, right? And while we do rate that as having positive implications on so many accounts, if you are a game sense dependent player, that won't take you as far in Overwatch 2 because the game's getting simplified and focused a bit more on skill rather than memorizing the flowchart of the order of operations to play the game mode. But back to my Dota comparison, I think what you might expect is the evolution of a more refined carry role in Overwatch 2, because with only 5 players and limited MOBA-esque resources to go around, they can't really be spread evenly to sort of protect your formation. I think all their balance decisions indicate that that just functionally won't be possible. So instead, combining them together on, let's say, like a Doomfist going in or a Reaper teleporting on the engage onto squishies that don't have defenses. Remember, there's no off tank. The thing that stops this kind of play from working is the enemy having a diva they can quickly turn around. Well, if you have to have either a diva or a Rein, you have to choose, do we peel or do we push? Your 5v5 team comp won't be capable of both, which at the end of the day, I'm very excited about this because, and the way you'll have to position around the map geometry is also similar to like lurking around for a gank in Dota, where it's more about setting up your attack angles as opposed to having any like barrier of cover to make an easy formation. That style of Overwatch is dead. There is no such thing as 2 tanks in front that you can hide behind to walk almost anywhere. No, every corner you turn is a threat of death. So your approach to navigating the entire map all the time will feel entirely different than the safety you're used to in Overwatch 1, where you can have multiple tanks. What it should mean is that different sections of the map will be benefiting different playstyles, and you'll have a more simple, straightforward approach to which tank you pick. And the simple matter is, there are no easy team comps, at least in theory. When GOATS was overpowered, you literally just picked those 6 characters and walked them around together, and they functionally couldn't die. That's the epitome of RPG balancing, where with the right build, you can break the game. But the new style of balancing we have, a competitive shooter game, I call it a hero shooter game, which accounts for the Brigidas and Reinhardts of the world, who don't have shooty, but also like bashy, okay? But either way, they too to the rules of navigating an FPS map, as opposed to I can largely ignore the map, but just stay with my team. Concluding, I think that's awesome. I think this is all amazing. I think this is great. I think this is exactly what the game needs. I think it's going to be so good that we're not going to have the problem where every tier of play feels entirely different. I think we're going to have a much more straightforward approach to the game. I think ranked will feel better because you can pop off from any of these roles. I think balancing will be easier. I think map design will matter more even than it already does. Leaning towards the directions I've already liked. I like so much of this. I just need to admit that I think the players who want to have the most casual, low knowledge version of the game, where their approach is I just sort of group with my team and vaguely give them resources like we're playing World of Warcraft, half asleep, casting your macros as the boss falls over. You can't play Overwatch like that anymore. We're really far from that now in Overwatch 1, and I think we'll be farther in Overwatch 2. It's made me nothing but confident about the direction the devs are going. I just want more. It's frustrating to not know what the new feature is going to be around the corner or know if they're ever going to get to doing the ranked fixes I think the game desperately needs. But I think from their point of view, moving in this direction fixes everything. The less reliant you are on your teammates doing the right thing for you to be able to function, the more fun you can have with randoms. And although I wish they leaned into the team aspect of the game more, this reimagining of what Overwatch plays like will make it the most playable for most people. But there is that small section that I think is kind of being left in the dust. And I don't know, maybe they're gonna have to go play Smite or something instead. I'm not sure. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comment section down below. Are you excited for the evolution of the competitive hero shooter to finally finish with Overwatch 2, hopefully coming early next year? Let me know in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave it with a like, and don't forget to hit subscribe and click the bell icon to actually get notified when our videos go live. Link to the description is our Twitter, where we've been discussing with you guys the state of the game. Happy to talk to you over there. Click that link in the description as well. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for your Overwatch. We'll see you guys next time.